basically, oh, not quite yet, but, okay, and then it's down here. All right, so that's, at least now we're looking at something, right, as opposed to the, okay.
The other thing is, make sure the mic is close to you, please. People can hear.
I just don't know. Good morning. So we'll start right on time. I hope everybody had a chance to have a little coffee, and I hope everyone from the coffee room is back with us now. I just had a few logistics to say before we start the program. Just to let you know, the emergency doors, there's one here, one at the back of the auditorium, and then you exit to Independence, so it's the door that you came in, so if there's an emergency. Restrooms are off of the lobby that you came through. This session will go till noon, unless we go fast and are short. And then from 12 to 12:30, there will be a self-guided tour of conservation, so you're welcome to come in and visit the labs with us. Lunch will be on your own, and the folders that you got at registration have various restaurant information in them so that you can get, but nothing is really close to here, so plan on a little time for that. Then at 1:15, from 1:15 to 2, there'll be coffee and sweets back in the conference room where you just had coffee and breakfast. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the Sixth Forbes Symposium. And we're very glad to have you all back. We had a very successful event and a very interesting lecture last night. And today we continue. I'd like to introduce the moderator for our session. And it's Marian Webb, who is very well known in the world of conservation of lacquer. She was the decorative arts conservator at the Royal Ontario Museum for 28 years, where she carried out scientific examinations of objects, research into materials, techniques, and manufacture and deterioration on a wide variety of organic materials. She was responsible for the conservation of all painted objects, including polychrome sculpture, Egyptian coffins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and of course lacquer. And her publications include one of the seminal books on conservation, or the seminal book on conservation of lacquer in our field. And with that, Marian.
Good morning. I'm really pleased to be able to chair this session because I've known the speakers for a number of years, and I really admire their enthusiasm for their research and their generous sharing of knowledge. So we're going to start the morning with Donna Strawn. Donna received her BA in Chinese language and MA in the Conservation of Ethnographic and Archaeological Objects from George Washington University. She's been a conservator at the Conservation Analytical Lab, Smithsonian, and at the Walters Art Museum in Boston. She was head of conservation at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco for 8 years, and from 2006 to 14, Donna was the conservator in charge of Asian objects at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Currently, she's head of the Department of Conservation and Scientific Research here at the Freer and Sackler Galleries of Art. Donna was also the head conservator at the archaeological excavations of Harappa, Pakistan, Tel Aswayat in Syria, and Troy in Turkey, where she set up field laboratories and trained students. Donna is also a guest lecturer at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and has lectured and published widely. Her major interests are technology and the preservation of ancient metals and Asian lacquer. This morning, she's going to speak to us about exploring techniques of early Chinese Buddhas. Donna?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you back again, if you were here last night. So, this has been a long time in coming. At least this has been a large part of my life over these years, these Lacquer Buddhas. So it's a wonder for me. It's really marvelous to have them here together in an exhibition. Unlike those crafted in stone, metal, or clay, Chinese Lacquer Buddhist sculptures are extremely rare. The three earliest known examples, dating from the late 6th to the early 7th century, are all life-size and all in the United States. Denise Patriolaitis' talk last night provided the context for these extraordinary images. So let's take a look at the fabrication technique. Not much was known about early Chinese Buddhist lacquer techniques because so few sculptures exist. The exhibition, Secrets of the Lacquer Buddha, provided an opportunity to study the construction, repairs, and internal features of these three Buddhas, along with two later period bodhisattvas. Our goal was to determine how and of what these unique sculptural images were made. To answer questions concerning their structure and composition, we applied multiple analytical methods. And it was only through the collaborative efforts of many individuals, museums, and laboratories that enabled us to carry out this extensive study on these images. The late 6th century life-size Walters Buddha is the earliest preserved example of a sculpture using the wood core lacquer technique, and it's said to have come from the Da Fosu temple in Hebei province. The early 7th century Buddha in the Metropolitan Museum is said to also have come from Da Fosu temple in Hebei. And the early 7th century Buddha from the Freer, we are not sure where it originated because it only came into the Freer in 1944. And we're not, again, sure of its provenance from before then. The Freer and Metropolitan Buddhas are the earliest extant examples produced by the hollow core lacquer technique. Both differ stylistically from the Walters sculpture and are later in date. These dates were determined both stylistically and technically by C14 dating. However, the C14 dating dates are so broad that it's really not useful for comparison of these pieces. And Denise and I believe that these two Buddhas, the Metropolitan and the Freer, probably came from a group of 4 sculptures. In addition to these 3 sculptures, we were able to study a monumental 8th century bodhisattva head from a private collection. The head is only a fragment of a much larger sculpture, and it would have been nearly 8 feet tall if it was a seated image. The 5th sculpture is a small 13th century bodhisattva sculpture in the Freer collection, and both of these are made by the hollow core lacquer technique. This study allowed us to examine lacquer sculpture materials and methods across 7 centuries. And although it's only 5 sculpture, it did offer insights into the relationship between the use of lacquer as a sculptural medium and religious practice during this formative period of East Asian Buddhism. We thought that such sculptures were expensive and fragile, and through scientific analysis we have confirmed this, but many questions remain, of course. Though they were created over a 700-year period, there were many similar techniques and materials. I mean, one of the questions was, were the same techniques and materials used in all 5 sculptures? And could the materials shed light on the images used as reliquaries? And could the Metropolitan and Freer Buddhas have been from the same workshop, but by different hands? Or was each one the work of a single artist? Well, we were not able to answer all these questions, but we did uncover some substantial new insights. Lacquer is a very difficult, time-consuming, and expensive craft. The first step is to create a core onto which the lacquer can be sculpted. Once the core is completed, layers of cloth strips wet with lacquer are applied, helping to create a more detailed 3-dimensional form. Although all 5 sculptures were fabricated in the same lacquer method, only the Walters is constructed with a wood core, and it is composed of 12 pieces of solid wood that were carved and then pegged together with wooden dowels or iron nails. The back was hollowed out, providing a cavity which probably held consecratory material. And this material in Chinese sculpture can be anything from sutras, textiles, semi-precious stones, fragrant woods, and grains, as well as cloth reproductions or even metal reproductions of human organs. The wood panel was originally covered the cavity. It's now missing. The holes in the back of the Buddhas, the Metropolitan and the Freer, they're very strange because they're so irregular, and there is restoration on the sculptures, but these holes were not filled in. To me, they might be robbing holes at some point, somebody trying to get into the backs of the sculptures, maybe when they were on display somewhere. But we can't quite explain them, and they're still open. The development of hollow core lacquer sculpture was an important improvement over wood core lacquer technique. Without wood, objects become insect impervious since lacquer is toxic. They're also very lightweight. The Freer and Metropolitan Buddhas only weigh about 30 pounds, while the Walters, on the other hand, weighs probably about twice as much. Their hollow bodies also provide space for depositing consecratory materials. To begin with, a hollow core lacquer sculpture, the artist makes a clay core in the shape of a desired image. Once the sculpture is nearing completion, the core is removed, leaving a hollow shell. They're hollow from the tops of their heads through the torso cavity and open on the bottom. We don't actually know what the original core material was made of since it's gone, but there are traces of clay on the interiors. Wood pieces have been used for support in both sculptures, although not always in the same location. Both the Freer and Metropolitan Buddhas have narrow wood pieces enclosed in textile running around the interior edges of their bases. These provide structural support to a location that receives much wear and aids in securing a cover over the open bottom. Some of the pieces of wood are later replacements, but the original pieces are still enclosed in the original textiles. Additionally, embedded in the textile in the Metropolitan image are 3 wooden boards running vertically up the Buddha's back, acting as a spine. The Freer Buddha doesn't have any wood in his back. However, his forearms are formed from 2 pieces of wood that are butt joined just below the elbow. There's no wood in the smaller Freer Bodhisattva, presumably because it is such a small size, and it didn't need any internal support. All 4 sculptures have clay in between drapery folds or in their noses, ears, lips, and eyes to form more fuller dimensions. The smaller Bodhisattva's clothing is much simpler, and it doesn't seem to have any clay in between any of the layers, except perhaps in its ears. Only the Bodhisattva head still contains accessible clay clinging to the interior of the face, in the recesses of the lips, chin, and nose. A sample revealed it to be a gray, tan, unfired clay of fine texture. The clay was uniform in particle size with no added organics visible in the SEM photos. However, a large carbon peak present in the EDS spectra was later identified as lacquer, which was probably used to adhere the textile onto the clay. The head is essentially a mask. It's completely open in the back, providing access to study. And to determine how detailed the head's original clay core was, the interior was scanned by Smithsonian exhibits. And then a positive print of the interior was created. It revealed that a surprising amount of detail was carved in the original core. Examination of the interior of the Freer and Metropolitan sculptures revealed that their cores were not as detailed, perhaps because of their smaller size, but we were unable to get inside, especially the head area, such a tight space, to do any scanning. The Freer and Metropolitan Buddhas have exposed wood slabs in the back of their heads. Or, excuse me, they aren't exposed, they're square wood slabs. They're right there. In the radiographs, the 2 large horizontal nails can be seen penetrating the boards of both sculptures. The Metropolitan has the remains of 2 large iron nails still in the holes. The two similar holes present in the same location on the Walters wood head, and in the radiograph you can really see clearly the wood grain. So all of them are missing. These holes were for adding halos to the backs of their heads, which are all missing. And now all of them are filled in and repaired, so looking in the x-rays was the best way to identify this. And since the back of the head of the large bodhisattva head is missing, we can only guess whether it had a halo, but I would think that it probably did. The smaller freer bodhisattva did not have a halo. It's hollow, and it has a square in its back for aiding the removal of the core or for depositing consecratory material. It was closed after the sculpture was completed, since the square can be seen on the inside and the outside. The hands of the three life-size Buddha sculptures are missing. They were attached separately and probably made of wood or perhaps lacquer with iron armatures in the fingers, similar to the method used for the freer bodhisattva. He originally wore a diadem, and there are nail holes around his crown, although sadly it's missing at this point. So once the clay or wood core of the sculptures was completed, it was covered with cloth strips wet with lacquer. The textile provided the dried brittle lacquer with more strength, making it more durable, especially when the wood core expanded and contracted during changes of relative humidity. However, the movement of the wood does cause the lacquer to crack or fracture, especially along the wood joints. Strips of plain woven textile were dipped in lacquer and placed over the core piece by piece. Small individual strips allow for more control over shrinkage and stretching of the textile than a larger piece of fabric would have. The cloth layers were built up, and when needed, additional strips were used to create folds in the drapery and enhance other details over the core. Some locations have as many as 6 layers of cloth, while others only have 2. For a more three-dimensional effect, clay was again used to bulk out the textile. All 4 hollow core sculptures used strips of plain weave textile of varying lengths. The thread counts of all the sculptures range from 10 to 16 threads per centimeter. They all have an S twist to the fibers except the freer bodhisattva, which has a Z twist. And the fibers of all 5 sculptures was identified by polarizing light microscopy as hemp. The interiors of the sculptures used, of all 4 hollow core sculptures, originally were in contact with the clay core, have a reddish-brown color to their textiles. In the bodhisattva, the reddish-brown material was identified as lacquer, while at one point we thought it might be a pigment. In this case, it's lacquer. Studying the X-radiographs and the CT scans, it became clear that the sculpture was built in 2 phases. For the larger hollow core sculptures, that is the freer Metropolitan and the head, in the first phase, the textile and lacquer were applied to the cores, leaving the top of the head open. The textile was bulked with clay to form naturalistic folds in the robes, and once the textile layers and the lacquer cured, the clay core was removed from the bottom and out the top of the head. This also provided access to the interior of the face. At this point, the eyes could be set in. This included the third eye that is now missing on all of the large sculptures. After work on the interior was complete, the second phase commenced by attaching the top section of the head. The separately attached section can be seen on the interior of the sculptures and in the radiographs. Then more textile was added, and finally lacquer layers covering all evidence of the separately attached section on the exterior. The ears of all 5 sculptures are constructed in a similar manner. The earlobes were formed of U-shaped iron wires with a square cross-section that can be seen in radiographs. Clay was applied over the wires, and then multiple layers of lacquer were applied over top of the clay. The eyes of all 5 images are similar in that they're white with black shiny pupils. The Walters eyes have been replaced and have restored eyebrows, or eyelids rather. X-ray fluorescent analysis identified that they are calcium-rich but not glass. The eyes in the Metropolitan and Bodhisattva are leaded glass, and the freer Buddha and the freer Bodhisattva's original eyes are potassium alkali glass. Copper and iron is consistently found in all the hollow core lacquer images of their eyes. But I should note that none of the glasses contain barium. The Metropolitan and the Bodhisattva's eyes are dark green spheres, and bubbles help to confirm that they are glass, along with the XRF analysis. Lacquer objects are usually made of multiple layers of lacquer, taking weeks of work and even up to a year to complete a single object. Asian lacquer is a resin produced by a sap of a number of trees belonging to the Anacardiaceae family. Regardless of the type of sap used, the refining and fabrication techniques of lacquer is similar. The main tree species that this resin comes from is Todoxodendron veneticiflum, and it's grown in northern China, Japan, and Korea. The raw lacquer resin is toxic and causes a poison ivy-like contact dermatitis that may be severe and even fatal. This sticky substance is essentially a water and oil emulsion that sets by polymerization to a tough and durable film. The tree is usually tapped like a rubber tree, and the sap darkens when exposed to oxygen. The sap needs to be purified, and when applied to the surface, it requires a temperature between 68 and 80 degrees, and also a high relative humidity of more than 65% to harden into an impervious film. And what's most difficult is that each layer must cure before the next layer can be applied. Processed lacquer can have additives such as extenders and coloring materials added, and when lacquer is applied to an object, the first or lowest layer is often bulked with fillers to seal and fill the flaws in the support. Fillers may vary and include things such as raw or fired powdered clays, sawdust, starches, ground up dried lacquer, shells, bone, blood, ash, and wood ash. And then finally on top, thinner layers of lacquer are applied. When exploring the components of a lacquer, the most prevalent inclusion of all 5 sculptures is ground partially burnt bone. It's clearly used as a filler to bulk up the lacquer, creating a dough-like paste that made it much easier to apply to vertical surfaces. Bone powder particles are non-absorbent, lightweight, and non-reactive to the very acidic lacquer. The bone particles are visible using microscopy, and their identification was confirmed by EDS in a scanning electron microscope. So what kind of bone was used in these sculptures? That was one of the first questions I asked when looking at first the Walters and then the rest of them. Was it human or animal? Attempts at answering these questions with DNA analysis were unsuccessful. However, there was enough protein in the lacquer to be analyzed by proteomics and determine the bone species. The Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute ran the analysis and determined that the major source of bone protein in the Freer, the Metropolitan, and the Walters is equid, or horse or donkey. However, since it's not possible to, and then I should also let you in on that we found out that the Bodhisattva head and the Freer Bodhisattva are horse. I got that backwards. The cow is in the earlier ones and the horse is in the later ones. However, it's not possible to separate the bone from the lacquer, so further research needs to be done to determine whether other protein materials in the lacquer, such as animal glue, might have affected the proteomic results. Now, Blythe McCarthy will be discussing this and also delve into the lacquer layers in the next talk. So after the layers were applied and cured, the sculptures were painted. Many pigments cannot be mixed with lacquer because it's acidic, and therefore the medium for the paint layers is usually a protein. Today, much of the pigment that remains is barely visible, and the designs are highly fragmented. All 5 sculptures were originally painted following a similar color scheme. And often the sculptures were restored or repainted multiple times during their service. As you can see in this one cross-section, it gives you an idea of how many different times, one particular spot was repainted. The black layers in the bottom are the lacquer layers, and you can see a few lighter colored bone particles in there. And then we've got multiple white grounds and a number of pigmented layers on top. It's not always possible to analyze all the pigments or the layers, but I can give you a brief summary of the pigments we did identify. We used polarizing light microscopy and XRF. The chart shows identified pigments, but they weren't necessarily from the lowest pigment layer. But in general, the skin areas of all had a white ground with a pink layer over top, and then the skin was covered with gold leaf to provide the physical manifestation of the Buddha's achievement of nirvana. All of them had azurite blue hair, vermilion red lips, and their shawls usually were made up of a patchwork of red squares with black or purple edging. Some variations used green in the patches. The Metropolitan Buddha retains most of the color, and this is an illustrated image that's been reconstructed for the appearance of the latest color that we found on the surface. The Bodhisattva's jewelry is made of lacquer putty, rolled out and some pressed into a mold before applying it to the sculpture. And it was then embellished with gilding and pigment. So we've confirmed that the sculptures were made of expensive materials and that they were time-consuming to create. And though they were fabricated over a 700-year period, the same traditions and similar techniques and materials were used in most of the sculptures. However, we're still studying the Bodhisattva, the freer Bodhisattva, and we're not sure what the resin is at this point. We found that the techniques used were much more complicated than those used to create utilitarian lacquer objects. And along with the high quality of the materials and the rarity of the objects, this suggests that the sculptures were fabricated in workshops that received imperial patronage, or at least the support of an elite group. We don't know the lacquer workshop structure, however, and nor do we know whether the workshops operated out of monasteries or were private industries. So I hope and encourage anyone who has lacquer objects to continue this study and add more to our research. I especially want to thank the Metropolitan Museum and the Walters Art Museum for allowing us to study their sculptures and for packing and transporting them down to the freer so carefully for the exhibit. And the help of many colleagues was instrumental in all of this research, and I'd like to thank all of them. Thank you. We've got a few minutes if there are any questions. Yes, Mark. There might be a microphone coming around.
You mentioned, I think, that there might have been plates across the bottom to close off these figures. Do we actually have evidence for any closure plates?
It's very difficult because the bottoms are so worn. I looked. I'm not sure. I mean, there are nail holes in some of those through the textile, whether that was produced by a mount or whether that was produced by a sheet covering it. I do know that the large 5th century bronze Buddha, 5 feet tall, at the Metropolitan Museum had a metal cover over the back. So I would guess that these certainly would have been closed.
Donna, the urnas are covered now, and I think yesterday at the questions you mentioned that was a restoration, that the urnas were covered. And do you have a sense of if they would have had anything inserted in them, or what they're filled with now, or when they might have been covered?
We don't really know, but looking at other sculpture, I would guess a gemstone, probably a crystal, but a stone of some sort, probably taken out quite early at one point. Yeah.
You mentioned that the backs of the heads, they had been replaced with a piece of wood where the halo was attached, and I was wondering if you had any sense of the size of the halo or the material, and if there's any evidence for the use of metal decorations as we see with early Japanese lacquer sculpture.
I don't see any evidence of any other attachments at all. And actually, the wood was not replaced in the back of the head. It's embedded in the textile layers, so we know it was part of the original plan when the sculptures were made. It's just they filled in those holes and patched it up in all those areas, so without the X-ray, we wouldn't have really known they were there.
I have a question about the buildup of the flesh areas. So you mentioned there was a white ground and then a pink layer followed by gold leaf. Do you think that that pink layer was serving as a kind of bowl for the gold leaf, or just a pigmented layer?
Well, that's a good question, because actually the Walters, from what I can tell, only has the gold in the front, and so the flesh on his back is still pink. So it may be that they wanted to have it look like human flesh, and then because gold was so expensive, they only put it in the area that would show. Because of course, if you had a halo back there, or the Buddhas are always shown in temples with their backs pretty much up against a wall or the halo.
I would like to ask you a question. I think from the lacquer layer, they have blood and can understand why some bone, I mean corn bone or house bone particle inside the lacquer.
You know, I'm going to refrain from answering that because Blythe McCarthy is going to be getting into detail in just about 2 minutes.
Okay. Another question. I would like to know different lacquer layer and pigment layer, how thick. Probably, I suppose probably the later dynasty craftsmen probably they over brushed or some.
We've only seen the evidence of relacquering in the Walters, and again, Blythe will show you more details about that. And that overlacquering may actually have been done fairly soon after the sculpture was made, just because we don't see a lot of dirt, or at least it was certainly sanded down finely.
Last night we heard that the red on the interior of at least one sculpture was cinnabar. Was that confirmed on some or all, or?
No, at this point it's not been confirmed. So far we've only found lacquer.
Okay.
I haven't done any analysis yet on the freer bodhisattva, and that does look more like cinnabar and different from the lacquer in the other sculptures. So I think we have to close here and let Blythe answer some of the other questions that may have come up.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Donna. That was really, really interesting. Our next speaker is Blythe McCarthy, and she's an Andrew W. Mellon Senior Scientist here at the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Galleries. Her research focuses on scientific analysis of Asian art. She was at the Getty Conservation Institute 1996 to 98, a DAA Fellow at the Fraunhofer Institute for Silikatforschung in Würzburg, Germany from 1994 to 96. And an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. State Department 2015 and 16. She holds a PhD in Materials Science and Engineering from Johns Hopkins University and a bachelor's and master's degree from MIT, and she's also a professional associate of AIC. So Blythe, she's going to talk about lacquer analysis of 4 Buddhist figures, and of course we're all waiting for this.
I have to figure out how to get this back up. All right. Thank you. I'm happy today to talk about a project that we've been working on for a while, and Donna's giving you a lot of information about the Buddhas. I will focus today on the lacquer layers. There are numerous Chinese texts and historical documents that mention lacquer, but few of them contain in-depth fabrication details. And fortunately, recently, due to the Getty, and you'll hear about that today from Michael Schilling, there are new analytical techniques for understanding lacquer and understanding the types of material that it contains. And so that's made it possible to identify the materials included in many Asian lacquer objects, and in particular, today, what I'll talk about in these 4 Buddhist figures. So the methods that I've used in these studies, we've taken very small samples, sufficient for the preparation of cross-sections, and for pyrolysis, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. And these were removed from areas of loss on the 4 hollow core lacquer sculptures. The samples were polished into cross-sections, and they were examined using reflected and ultraviolet light microscopy. Using methods developed by Nanka Shellman that were taught in the Getty's radical workshops, we stained them with amido black, now blue sulfate, potassium iodide, and Sudan black, B. And these were applied to the lacquer samples, and then the cross-sections again viewed under visible and ultraviolet light. This helped us to identify the components in each of the lacquer layers. Now, the stains that we applied during microscopy did help us to localize some of the materials that were identified by GCMS. And where it worked, this was helpful, as some of the layers of the lacquer were too thin to allow us to get GCMS results from a single layer. Overall, however, the stains were of only limited utility, as many of them stained black. And while these lacquers are black on black on black on black. So with the PI GCMS, the gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, we use that to identify lacquer type and the organic components mixed in each lacquer layer. Using the National Institute for Standards and Technology's AMDIS, or Automated Mass Spectral Deconvolution and Identification System, we considered anything that was greater than an 80% match. The results from this were then fed into the Getty's ESCAPE expert system for analysis of lacquer components to enable the interpretation of the data. In addition to these techniques aimed at organic analysis, we looked also at scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to isolate some of the inorganic elements present in the lacquer layers and to get an overview of where the bone was present, because as Donna has mentioned, there's pretty much bone everywhere in these samples. Elemental distribution maps were produced to confirm the location of specific elements within the cross-section layers. Now, for a lacquer layer structure, there's a common structure that we think of when we think of lacquer layers. And of course, this is not an example of the Buddha, but it's one where you can see the layers very easily. It includes a core down at the bottom, and then a foundation, intermediate layers that are of rougher materials, and then finishing layers, and then the decorative paint layers. The foundation layers are often composed of various materials such as clay, bone, and sand, ground brick, as well as many others, and are thought to contain little lacquer. Then you have the intermediate and finishing layers, which contain a variety of materials but often have the lacquer in them. In examining and attempting to compare the samples from the 4 Buddhist images, I thought of this terminology and the techniques that we use in examining Chinese lacquer, namely these core, foundation layers, intermediate layers, and finish layers. So this is a scanning electron image that Federico Caro took of the Metropolitan Buddha, the cross-section from the Metropolitan Buddha. And when I started to look at the samples from the 4 sculptures, none of them really seemed to follow this structure of core, foundation, intermediate. So starting with the cross-section shown here, you have the hollow core, fine, but then, and you have a textile layer that's visible at the very bottom of the image. 2 layers of lacquer, and the white particles are bone, actually. So 2 layers of lacquer at the bottom, then a very thick layer with fibers and lacquer, and 3 finishing layers at the top. And truthfully, if it hadn't been for the textile, every time I looked at this sample, I had to convince myself again what was the top and what was the bottom. And without that textile, I would have had problems remembering what side was up, as it did not have the progression I would have expected, that from the prior slide. The other 3 samples also did not follow a foundation, intermediate, finishing layer lacquer structure. Okay, and these are pictures of the 4 different lacquer samples. So note that the scale of the 2 at the bottom is similar, but the 2 at the top are much larger. I took these images so that they were as close as possible to showing the entire cross-section of the sample that I had. The Walters image at the upper left is approximately twice the thickness of the bottom 2, and the Metropolitan was 3 times the thickness. So there's quite a range in thickness in these samples. So with what appears to be very different structures, it was very difficult to directly compare them. The Walters Buddha, the sample from it had 17 layers. The Met has this very thick layer in the center with fibers and lacquer. And the Bodhisattva at the bottom from the private collection has a thick middle layer with very large fragments of bone. From the analysis, some similarities in the samples were readily apparent. All 4 sculptures that in this study tested to have lacquer solely from Toxicodendron farnesifluum. No other lacquer types were found. They all also use partially burnt bone, and the partially burnt part is actually important. All have a layer that includes plant fibers, most likely sawdust. They also have the common feature of being fairly monochrome, black. And as you can see this in these images. Now, the black was a definite challenge when sampling for the GCMS runs, where we were trying to obtain samples from each individual layer for a run. While these images represent the color of the lacquers, for the rest of this presentation, I will use primarily photos taken under UV illumination. While it's useful to have both the visible and the UV images, the layer structures are much more readily seen for these samples in the UV images. Okay. So for sampling, we're generally limited to where we can take a sample and also the size of a sample. This slide shows the sample location from the Walters. And of course, this is the one of the 4 that has a wooden core. So for the Walters Buddha and the Bodhisattva, the private collection, not the Freer, samples were taken from an area of flesh. And here we see the Walters at the location is at the upper back. For these 2 sculptures, it was possible to remove samples that extended through the object down to the core. And that's one of the reasons here we have a 17-layer sample. For the samples removed from the Metropolitan Buddha and the Freer Buddha, we were not able to go all the way down to through the core, to the core, in this case, hollow core. The samples were removed here from the Metropolitan. You can see the top layer of lacquer down to the first textile layer is this sample. So from this area down and including this beige textile. It does not include these further layers of lacquer and textile. It was not possible to sample the whole, partially because as the samples were being taken, the lacquer would break off at the textile layers. And in addition, to sample it all the way through, it would have been a very large sample. But because of the sculptural process, the layers of lacquer vary from location to location, And sampling location determines the layer structure that will be visible in any sample, not unlike the variation in layers one would see for samples removed from a painting. While it would seem likely that the final layer or layers were applied to the whole piece, the whole figure, the lower layers would vary from area to area, or according to the need of the artist to build up localized design elements. For example, as Donna Strawn mentioned earlier, the X-rays show that three-dimensional areas of the design were produced in the robes by bulking with clay. Now, I did not see clay in these samples, but that again is a sign that you have localized differences. The takeaway here is that you can't assume from one sample that you understand the structure of the object, especially when you're dealing with a sculptural process. With this in mind, I attempted to group the layers by function and not order and structure of the way the piece was made. So for the Walters Buddha, because of the size of the cross-section, I've split it into two so you can more easily see the layers. It's the most complex, with 17 layers above the textile. The top section layers are visible in this image. The cross-sections are lettered from the bottom to the top layer, and so here, this will continue in the next slide. In addition to the bone added to the Walters Buddha, oil, tannins, starch, a cedar oil, or it's a tree resin, soot, paper markers, possibly blood and indigo were found using GCMS. Protein occurred in all layers, as determined by staining the cross-section. Soot was found in the surface layer, either from soil or a pigment. Starch was found in lower lacquer layers, consistent with the chopped fibers seen in the cross-section that added bulk to the layers. And this large layer here has examples of small chopped fibers within it. So the layer G. LME resin and beeswax from a previous conservation treatment were seen in all layers. These materials were used along with paraffin wax on the entire sculpture as many, many years ago, as it was dipped in a wax bath to secure flaking painted surface decoration. The museum's records of treatment were critical in allowing us to separate the conservation materials from the original lacquer components. Still, it's not possible to tell if any waxes are present from original materials due to the presence of the conservation waxes. The presence of the wax also interferes with identification of any oils added during production of the Buddha. Now, if you look closer at the Walters cross-section, there's an unusually uniform and sharp interface between layers F and G. And so that would be this very straight line. And as you notice, most of these, well, this is my drawing, but most of these are very rough layers. So at first, when I started to look at this, since this is the only straight interface that I see in any of these samples, I wondered if it was proof of a restoration. There's a few different possible explanations, and that's one of them. Since some of the pigments, or the majority of the pigments on the sculpture look like they're original or at least very old, we were thinking if it is a restoration, it has to be an older one. Other possibilities are that it could have been a longer curing time and the lacquer could have been harder when they polished it. Now, it's not just a very uniform interface. There's also evidence these are the bottom layers. And then again, you can see it continues down. But there's evidence of polishing in that some of the particles at this interface are cut in half and extend right up to the edge. So if it had become harder, and so you get a better polish in a very straight line before putting on the next layer. But the more I look at it, the more I think that it's really evidence of the fact that they're using a very thick and viscous paste, lacquer paste, as they form this. And this is the only instance where it's not viscous. because if you're using a putty, you're going to have a much rougher surface because it will be not too viscous to level and be flat and uniform. Where if it's a thinner lacquer layer, you would expect some leveling and a much more even interface. Of course, there is still evidence of polishing here. But to me, these very uneven layers provide evidence that all of the lacquer applied, or at least all of the lacquer we've seen, except for this one example, were applied as fairly thick, viscous pastes. Now, in any case, if it's part of the original production, we expect the materials and the techniques across the interface to be fairly similar. And that is the case. Both the upper and lower layers contain the same lacquer, Toxicodendron vernicillifluum. They both have cedar oil and tannins, protein, and then the bone fragments. One exception is the use of the plant fibers in the layer immediately above this interface. But those plant fibers, very similar, are also seen in all the other sculptures. So that technique also seems to be what you would expect from this period. The one difference in this sculpture is that there are many, many thin layers towards the top of alternating light and dark. Now the color is mainly coming from the color of the bone, so you have some white bone and black bone, depending on the degree to which it was burnt. Okay. For the Metropolitan Buddha, I've split it up into 3 samples here because of the thickness of that central layer. The cross-section shows 5 lacquer layers above the textile. And again, remember, we're not going through the depth of the object. In addition to the bone added to the Metropolitan Buddha, gum benzoin was found in the textile layer. Oil, starch, cedar oil/resin, tannins, blood, and possibly soot. One organic additive to the lacquer, the cedar oil, is from trees of the family the cypress family, or other fir trees termed cedar oil here. This has been found in most lacquers of the Walters Buddha and 2 layers of the Metropolitan Buddha. Now, the gum benzoin, we were wondering if it could be a conservation material, but it wasn't found in the materials underneath the textile. So the textile it's about 2 layers into the sample. So maybe, maybe not. Now, at this time, it's not possible to tell if glue is present, as we're not sure of the difference between the marker compounds for glue versus those one might find for bone, because glue is often made from boiled bone or skin. Now, a marker compound, when I'm speaking of that, it means something characteristic of a certain material. Tannins were found in the lacquer-impregnated textile and the surface layer. And in this case, the fiber-bulked layer in the middle, the layer G, seems to have played a major bulking role and to make this so thick. For the freer Buddha, this cross-section also shows 5 layers above the textile. The freer Buddha was found to contain the bone, visible here as all the white and black particles, a drying oil, a wax, starch, soot, and blood. And in the freer Buddha, wax was found in the 2 interior layers as well as the textile layer. Since it's only in some of the layers, and those are on the interior, it suggests it may be original and not from a later conservation treatment. The Bodhisattva also found 5 layers above the textile, followed by a layer of paint and soil, very thin layers at the top. In the Bodhisattva, bone, as well as possibly heat-bodied Asian oil, unidentified, tannins, starch, and possibly blood were found using GCMS. So in comparing some of the GCMS results, these charts are very easy way to look at things together. On the right, we have a key to the different components. So I'm going to go through a few different layers of similar function. So the textile layer, I don't have results from the Walters Buddha, but for the other two, the Freer and the Met both have a high amount of oil, whereas the Bodhisattva has a large amount of protein in it. Now, the amount of large particles of bone in the Bodhisattva could account for this large amount of protein. And these pie charts allow us to quickly compare the components. The oil that's present in the Met and the Freer is not possible to identify the specific oils used, because with the exception of tongue oil, which was not seen in these objects, the fatty acids from the lacquer itself interfere in oil identification. There are markers for heat-treated oils, and the Bodhisattva's lacquer did include those markers. Hence, we can say that it has a small amount of heat-treated oils. As you can see, the red sliver in that one is much smaller. Heat bonding partially polymerizes the oils prior to use, resulting in a thickened oil that has lower shrinkage and is more durable after drying. And this thickened oil with a higher viscosity would be something that would be desirable for a putty. So this is the first layer above the textiles, and this would be a layer that has smaller bone particles and a less viscous. You'd expect a less viscous layer because the whole purpose of this layer is to smooth out the textile. Again, we have high amounts of oil in the Freer and the Metropolitan. The Walters is harder to look at. The big orange section that's tannins is also resins, and so that has the conservation treatment is affecting there. Okay. And then all four of the objects have a layer that had fibers, possibly sawdust. And these cellulosic materials were together with small amounts of quartz and other silicates in this layer. We could see several of the layers stained positive for starch, and we did identify also starch by GCMS. And in some cases, positive staining for starch occurred specifically at the edges of the fibers. And this occurred in the textile layer of the Freer Buddha, as well as interior layers with fiber pieces in the other sculptures. If the starch was added and not part of the fiber, it may have resulted in increased stiffness for the textiles or the fibers, and again, helped to stiffen the putty. Also, relevant for the cut fiber pieces, the starch may help strengthen the bond between the fiber and lacquer, reducing the possibility of cracking. In addition to the change in the viscosity, it could also possibly provide more tackiness to the lacquer paste in these bulking layers. Tannins, brown to black colorants that can come from several plant sources were also found in the Walters and Metropolitan Buddhas and the Bodhisattva. And in addition, there was a marker compound for soot found in both the Walters and Metropolitan. Okay. Now, this was actually quite unexpected for me to see the high amount of protein in the Bodhisattva and Freer on these finishing layers. Again, the Walters has a large offset because of the LME resin that's in the orange there. I expected more for the finishing layers to look like the Metropolitan Buddha, and with a larger amount of the lacquer in blue and oils in red. So when you have a thick layer, you can be fairly certain that you're just analyzing the layer. So for the Freer, we were able to take 3 samples progressing through the cross-section. And the one that was innermost in the object had oil and a mixture of oil and protein, as well as the lacquer and tannins, and then also, I can't read the last one, a smaller component. As we go into the textile, there's not as much protein. This suggests that a lot of the protein we're looking at is from the bone, because within the textile is the one place you do not see the bone. So again, we did EDS spectra, or mapping, to look at the location of the bone. And a backscattered image is at the upper left with silicon, and primarily we're seeing the silicon in the paint layers. So this would be silicates such as quartz and other compounds. With the calcium and phosphorus, I'm looking both at maps of calcium and phosphorus to confirm that it's bone, because without the phosphorus it could be calcite. And in the SEM I did find some particles of calcite mixed in with the bone. But the larger particles of bone in this cross-section are readily visible, but there also is phosphorus throughout the structure, and when we look at it in higher magnification, we do see small pieces of bone throughout the structure. So there's a huge amount of bone in these samples. So one of the most useful results that came out of the staining was looking at the images after Nile blue staining, which is a stain that stains for lipids and proteins. So because with this amount, since we know that the bone was burnt, one of the questions was, is there remaining organic material in the bone? Or could what we're looking at with all of these proteins actually come from glue that's mixed into the lacquer? But here, because the bone in particular is staining blue and black in visible light, so you have these particles that are all bone that before the stain, you have no blue, and then after the stain, it's localized in these bone particles, and then stain turns white bone to black. It shows that there is protein and or lipids in the bone fragments in these samples. So this actually does say that some of the proteomics that was done did at least include some proteins from the bone, because we weren't sure totally if the protein that was analyzed in the protein could be coming from the bone or from the lacquer. When you look at the composition of bone, there are proteins and lipids, proteins of various types, collagen, and then some that are non-collagen. So I have them circled in red here. The bone also has blood going through it, different small vessels feeding the cells, and of course bone is the place where you produce red blood cells. So there is a lot of reason to know that we have blood, we have bone, and we have the possibility of blood, glue, and bone. But we don't know what the marker compounds and how to tell these apart. We just know we have protein. So we were able, a couple of weeks ago, to go to a USDA, I keep think of it as a kill center, but it's actually a certified butcher, and get samples of blood, bone, and skin from single animals. And we hope to do GCMS as well as proteomics on those with Museum Conservation Institute very shortly, to try and see if we can tell the difference between these materials. And I will sort of conclude with the idea that, you know, the most important thing I learned out of this was not to think of lacquer as having a set structure, but to remember that when you're dealing with a sculptural process, it is the art. You have to think about the artist's intent as you look at your samples. And I thank everyone for all of the help that I received on this project and all the discussions. And hopefully I didn't, okay, too long.
I'm sorry there won't be time for questions for this one, because I know you're going to have lots of them for her. But you'll have to catch her at break, because I'm told we must keep on schedule. So the next speaker is Michael Schilling, who began his career at the Getty Conservation Institute in 1983, and he's a senior scientist and head of materials characterization group in the science department. Given the prevalence of organic materials in works of art, his group studies a broad range of traditional and contemporary museum objects and participates in field projects at World Heritage Sites. Recent areas of research include plastic sculpture, modern and contemporary paintings, wall paintings, faience portraits, lately a lot of animation cells, and of course our favorite, lacquers. The group teaches workshops about their analytical methodologies to scientists and art conservators and supports graduate research projects. Michael earned his BS and his MS degrees in chemistry from California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. Today, he's going to talk about 10 years of reflections on lacquer research at the Getty. Thank you.
Nice. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers, Donna and Blythe, for inviting me. This is quite an honor to be here. It's just a lovely get-together for lacquer lovers. And I can't wait to see the sculptures. And I also can't wait for the barbecue in Blythe's lab. The meat's going to smell good. Okay. All right. We'll use lots of spice. Okay. So it's just an overview of what we've been doing the last 10 years. Analytical method development. We studied lacquer formulations. We've learned more about lacquer aging. Our analytical workshops, PhD research that we're sponsoring, and then we've just started lacquer cleaning research. So I'll give you a little overview of everything, a little sampler. It all started 10 years ago, working with these two wonderful collaborators, Arlen Higginbotham on the right, many of you know him, and working with him has been a real honor and a privilege, and he's really made me a better scientist because he has a very analytical approach, and he never takes kind of fluffy answers and never accepts them. He wants more, and so we were able to do much more because he wanted more from us as scientists. Hrant Kanjan in the middle. He's one of the most careful scientists I know. I trust his work completely. He's very meticulous in the way he operates. And so the three of us have been playing with lacquer for about 10 years now, which was amazing to think about how long we've been doing this and how much territory we've covered. We started working on the project 10 years ago because Arlen and the curatorial staff wanted to do a catalog on our French furniture collection. Some of the objects in the collection were Asian lacquers, and the questions were, are the Asian lacquer panels on these French cabinets Asian or European? And of the Asian lacquers, are they Japanese or Chinese? So those were the basic questions that we had to answer. These are the objects that we have in our collection that are Chinese lacquer. We also have Japanese lacquer objects, but I won't show you any results from them. It's great speaking now after gifted speakers have already presented many of these topics, so I don't have to talk too much about cross-sections, but they're taken from areas of this panel that are underneath gilded mounts, so it doesn't leave a visible mark. And the thing that really distinguishes Japanese lacquer from European lacquer, other than the materials, are the numbers of layers. There are just many, many layers in the cross-sections, and each one we've found has fairly unique compositions, maybe not so much in these black on black on black, but for kind of traditional lacquer layering, you do see a fair amount of diversity in the compositions. The top layer, the one Achilles heel of lacquer is that it's sensitive to light. So it's always best to keep it away from light, filter the light if it has to be lit, because the top layers will start oxidizing and changing their chemical compositions. Okay, already seen something like this. I'm really going to talk exclusively about the lacquer from the chi lacquer, and then the lacquer type lacquer. I don't have any examples of Thitzi lacquer for you, but they're grown in Southeast Asia. Tapping methods vary depending on the country and the tradition. You can have single cuts in the bark, multiple cuts in the bark, and it's just harvested in different types of vessels. And it's a natural product, as has been pointed out before. Fun chemistry fact number 1. Most natural products, organic products, are composed of mixtures in varying proportions. That's very important to know. There are very few natural products that just have a single chemical in them. And so if you're looking at the natural products, the chemicals that are in the Asian lacquer sap, it's most of it's water. That's what's making it white. It's an emulsion. Catechol is kind of the active skin irritating ingredient that we all hate. But the catechols are the things that actually polymerize when the lacquer cures into a polymer. Carbohydrates, glycoproteins, enzymes, and fatty acids. Fun chemistry fact 2. Chemical aging happens of natural products. That's what makes our job as organic analytical chemists so challenging, that over time, unstable chemicals in these natural products react with oxygen, water, and light, sometimes with each other, to form new chemicals. Some of them are useful, like the polymer film that these lacquers form. Some are degradation products. I mentioned they form at the surface when there's light exposure. So for the fellow nerds out there, I hope there are a few out there, Asian lacquers are polymers of substituted catechols that often contain additives. So that's it for my nerd stuff. Everything else is going to be low-level science. But it's important to know it's the tree sap and almost always mixed with additives. And Blythe presented the kind of the list of additives that we're used to seeing in Chinese lacquer very well. These are the additives. Julie Chang, we were fortunate enough to have her work in my lab for about 2 years, and she and other people have compiled a list of these additives that the lacquer artist added to the tree sap. And they're just broad-based categories: oils, resins, other modifiers, and then pigments. These are the kinds of things that we can detect with our analytical method. That ideal analytical method then should be able to differentiate Asian and European lacquer, fully characterize the tree saps and additives and aging products, and all of that has to be done with the smallest sample possible. Okay, so the one that we picked was PyGCMS, pyrolysis GCMS. That's one of the PyGCMSs in our lab. Why did we pick it? It's good for analyzing polymers, so you don't have to dissolve your sample in a solvent and analyze it. You can just analyze it as is. To understand PyGCMS, let's talk about the smells of cooking. Okay, so for those of you who aren't nerds like me and who want to know a little bit about what the analytical method does, when you cook, you have a nice hot pan. You put some spices in it, some oils maybe. You start everything simmering, maybe some onions, and you start adding meat to it. And you can start smelling things happening right away. You'll start to smell compounds evaporating off of the spices. They're just evaporating off. There's nothing happening there other than just evaporation, no chemical degradation. If the meat is on there long enough, you can start smelling the meat. So the heat is breaking down that meat polymer into small molecules that you can start smelling. And if you have a good nose, you can differentiate the smell of chicken or beef or pork, things like that, right? And the longer it's there, the more complex the aromas get, but you don't smell the spices anymore. So if it's there long enough, your nose probably doesn't start detecting those. So there's really a time-based aspect to it as well. Heating, you get volatilization of small molecules coming from the spices, then the breakdown of the polymers into things that you can smell. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so our GCMS, our PyGCMS does that. It has a small furnace on the top of the instrument. That's what the sample goes into. It's a small sample, maybe 100 micrograms or so. Not very much powder at all is needed. So that's where the vapor is generated. That's your frying pan. And then your nose is really good at picking out chemicals in mixtures of chemicals. And so This instrument is the thing that does the detection. It's the mass spectrometer. It's not so good at that. So between the detector and where the vapors are generated, you have the GC. And what the GC does is it separates the molecules in that gas mixture by size. So the gas mixture goes into a very long, thin tube, and the small molecules come out first. It takes them maybe a few minutes to come out. Bigger molecules come out in the middle, kind of the fatty acids, the things you can smell from the oil, and then maybe the protein stuff comes out later. So anyway, the vapor is generated in the furnace. It's a cloud of gas, it's a mixture. The gas mixture is separated by the GC, and then the individual compounds are detected then, one at a time by the mass spectrometer. Okay? We add a magic chemical, TMAH, and we add a little droplet of that to the sample powder in the cup right before we pyrolyze it, and that's to give us better results. We chemists like sharp peaks, okay? So when you see peaks in our GCMS chromatograms, we like them sharp and tall and easy to detect, and that chemical does the job for us. I just want to check my watch. I don't want to blabber on too much. So that's what a typical result looks like if you're staring at our computer monitor. Each one of these straight lines up and down is a peak, and each peak relates to a chemical. So you can see that in a typical Asian lacquer sample, you have hundreds and hundreds of these peaks. So how would a scientist interpret that data? How do you identify the lacquer materials from those compounds that are separated? So as Blythe mentioned, we look for marker compounds, and they're compounds that are characteristic of a material. So again, going back to the cooking analogy, there might be a few chemicals in pepper that when you heat it, your nose can say, oh, that's pepper for sure, right? If it's there, you're going to detect it, even if it's there with other smells. And so that's an important thing to know, that there are chemicals that we would consider markers for the materials that we can positively identify. So those classes of compounds, oils, resins, tree saps, et cetera, they have their own individual marker compounds. The marker compounds might be present in the original material, so they might be there immediately in the material. They might also then form by aging or from pyrolysis, the act of heating it up in that little furnace. So the three sources of these marker compounds. So we know that if we detect marker compounds for a certain material in a sample, it's there. So that's how we do our job. So knowledge of marker compounds comes from experience. I started this 10 years ago. I had very little PyGCMS experience. This is my confession to you. And I looked at those chromatograms and I was just baffled by them, and I always wondered how someone developed enough experience to be certain that they were identifying all of the marker compounds. So you read lots of papers in my field, and you look at mass spectra, and you look at compound structures that are in the papers written by experts. You can contact them directly if they're friendly, and maybe they don't need much more than a box of chocolate from time to time. They'll give you some information that you need. But honestly, I was never quite sure that I was identifying all of the marker compounds. We needed something more. So we developed a better way, we think, to evaluate PyGCMS data. It's time for us to escape. Thank you for using the escape. We developed an expert system. And so what we did is we harvested the information from experts. The information might have been published, but we got the best information, I think, from interviewing scientists. And we took their knowledge of marker compounds and materials, and we put them into this expert system so that it was easier for us to do our job faster and better. So it's an expert system for characterization using Agnes plus Excel. We're really trying to keep up with the Europeans in their awesome acronyms, so we come up with our own acronyms from time to time. Blythe mentioned what Agnes is. You all know what Excel is. It's tax time. You probably have used it to look at your taxes. We have about 170 person years so far of experience in material characterization. That's the brain trust that's gone into the ESCAPE system. This is Professor Miyakoshi from Meiji University. He's worked on Asian lacquer, Japanese lacquer his whole life. He was an incredible source of information. His publications have just tens of thousands of hits. There's the four pyromaniacs, Natalie Balkar, who's done a lot of work on PyGCMS of synthetic paint media. Hank von Kuhlen has pyrolized everything known to man, but he was especially helpful for European materials, markers. Jenny Poulin from the Canadian Conservation Institute has done a lot of work on dyes and pigments and Baltic amber. Joy Mazurik works for me. She's done a lot of GCMS work on natural products. Catherine DeFate worked with me on adding marker compounds to escape for synthetic paint media. Ken Sutherland from the Art Institute of Chicago has published a lot on shellac. Chris Peterson at Winterthur, he doesn't know if he's coming or going here, I guess. So he checks the sign to see if he's in or out. He's done a lot of work on triterpene resins. This guy, Mike Zalewski, for those of you lucky enough to have learned AMDIS from him, he's the guy that taught me how to do AMDIS. My brain wasn't really up for the task. It took about a day and a half of him pounding it into my head till I finally understood what it did. And then, oh boy, I really did see the value of it. So he was patient and kind and knowledgeable, and he got all of the AMDIS knowledge I needed into my head. I'd like to talk about the federal government when it works well, and I think the NIST scientists who wrote AMDIS are brilliant because they've made our work so much better. And they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they did in AMDIS. And they made it actually to develop chemical weapon, to detect chemical weapons in forensic studies. So my hat's off to all of the scientists who worked on that. And we all love AMDIS because you load the data file, you load our Lacquer library. It has about 1,400 compounds in it right now, and you press that little run button over there in the top left. That's all you have to do, and it spits out this wonderful Excel list of compounds. And these are the compound names and retention times and retention indices, how big the peak is, if it's large or small, all that good stuff is there. So now, that looks pretty daunting to me still. Having that list of compounds is nice. I take comfort knowing that it was done well, but how do I then relate the materials back to the compounds back to the materials? So what this worksheet does that we did in Excel is it sorts them, all of the marker compounds by the class of materials. So all of the compounds that come from oils sorts them into the oil category. All of the compounds that come from resins sorts them into resins, and then it subdivides it by type of resin. That's kind of how it works. It reminds me a lot of the household budget that we do. And if you had a program in your household budget that could scan your receipts and then say, okay, that one's for gasoline, so it adds up all your gasoline receipts. These receipts are from your mortgage. This is from your food. This is from your household products. That's kind of what this does. So just think of it like a way of sorting data from compounds and putting them into the right categories. That's the expert part. That's where everybody really dug deep into their gray matter to help us write this system. Okay? So before you paste the AMDIS report in, the worksheet looks like that. After you paste it in, you get all the nice diagnostic graphs. This is the graph we use to analyze or identify the tree saps, the peak area pie charts that Blythe showed you, and then diagnostic information about the amount of aging of the lacquers down here. There are many more graphs, but I just wanted to show you those. Now, if your brain is already saturated with science, you might need a day between Saturday and Sunday, just like her. I hope everybody's ready to go on the journey now into looking at what we found in our lacquered objects. Okay, so before we get there, I wanted to talk a little bit about how well our work was received in the field. Arlen and I gave a talk at this wonderful conference, Crossing Borders. It was at the V&A, and it was on Japanese lacquer and all the wonderful things we learned about Japanese lacquer. We had a number of scientists and conservators come up to us and say, would you mind showing us how you did this? Are you publishing this? And so we decided to have training workshops that would allow scientists and conservators to work together to study an object in 5 days, learn the staining technique that Blythe showed you, how to sample the layers of lacquer and how to analyze them with PyGCMS. Put that all together in a 5-day workshop. We call it RADICAL, another one of our nifty acronyms, Recent Advances in Characterizing Asian Lacquers. This is Nanka Shellman, the person who did all of the work in her PhD looking at those stains. And there's Arlen again. talking about sampling, and then Hank and I are looking at samples on the PyGC. And this is the type of experience that you get if you were lucky enough to go to Radical. I see many Radical alums out there, so Radical power. Talking about the object that they're studying, talking about the cross-sections that they've looked at, talking about the analysis of the compounds that are in each lacquer layer. And then we have guest lecturers from time to time. This is Julie Chang talking about lacquer formulations that she found in the Chinese literature. So it's quite an exciting, fun experience. And again, sometimes it gives scientists and conservators a reason to work together. And all of them, when they do the review of the workshop, said that's the thing they value the most. We've had 4 of them. Sorry, I don't have the most recent one from the RCE in Amsterdam, but you see how many people have gone through the Radical workshop, around 70 or so. Let's talk about the furniture then, and we're going to breeze through this quickly because I think Blythe had the most relevant results to the theme of this symposium. So in this red commode, we would use these diagnostic gestalt graphs on the top to identify Lacquer lacquer. So you see a big peak at 10 carbons for that, and you see a big peak at 17 carbons for that. So that's the way that you would use these gestalt graphs to identify the type of lacquer. So you see Arushi has a different graph than Lacquer. And Lacquer, again, it's normally associated with Vietnamese and Taiwanese lacquer, but there's been a lot of work recently. A lot of people are analyzing lacquer now, which is really exciting, and much of the lacquer can actually be grown in the southeast part of China, so it doesn't have to travel very far in order to work its way into Chinese lacquered objects. Chinese export lacquer also has a lot of oil, and sometimes we try to identify the oil. Sometimes we just say it's a drying oil, and you see half of the peak area in the sample comes from tallow tree oil. So perilla oil comes from shiso seeds. This is a bar graph of the fatty acids that tells us it's a drying oil. We would calculate the area ratio of this peak to that peak. That's the P to S ratio, and you see that you really can't distinguish perilla and tallow tree, but you sure can differentiate tung oil. So I'm going to skip over that. Tung oil, difficult to heat body. We had a chance to go to the Lacquer Institute in Xi'an to look at lacquer kind of being processed, and they had a bucket full of goo, which looked like a bad batch of Jell-O sitting in the corner, and we said, what is that? And they said they tried to heat body tung oil, and it just turned into a big gel. So it's amazing that the Chinese craftsmen could make this stuff in the heat-bodied form that makes it more viscous, as Blythe mentioned. You know it's heat-bodied if you have these alkyl phenyl alkanoates that were talked about by Richard Evershed, who did a lot of work at Bristol University looking at potsherd residues. So if you have these green markers, you know you have a bodied oil, and if the P to S ratio is about 1, you know you have tung oil. Most Chinese export lacquer has cedar oil in it. It was highly concentrated in that layer there. And as Blythe mentioned, it comes from the Cupressus family, juniper, false cedars, and it grows in temperate China, so it's not unusual that they would use it in lacquer. Blood is often present in Chinese lacquer foundations. Julie and I did a lot of work on Chinese foundations, and blood was quite a reliable material in many of the foundations. And we use statistical analysis of the protein marker compounds to identify the type of protein. Carbohydrates are present in abundance in lacquer, and that was surprising. It shouldn't have been surprising, but we can actually see the marker compounds for them in the pyrograms. And it's quite a large wedge in there. It's not an insignificant amount of carbohydrates. So now that we know more about the actual composition of lacquer in objects and kind of the compositional differences in the layers, we thought that it was time to start looking more intensely at lacquer cleaning strategies and new options. So Marianne Webb nicely introduced me today, and she was the one who really wanted to work with us to do this research. I'm not going to talk much about it because it's still in development, and what we're doing right now is, I'll skip over that because of time, but we're making these lacquer panels, and so Marianne's been making these lacquer panels. They have different materials in them to represent the 3 different types of tree sap, different amounts of oil, resins, and things like that. We put them into an aging chamber. The early panels that we did, they were small and they fit inside our machine. It's called the weatherometer, and it uses strong light and humidity cycles to accelerate the process of light aging. The larger panels that Marianne's been making are going to go under banks of fluorescent light tubes to age them. It'll take a few months to do that, and then she's going to experiment with different cleaning strategies. So Marianne's the person to talk to about that research. We've also done a lot of good work actually just supporting PhD students. It might involve us testing hundreds of samples, but the amount of knowledge that comes out of a dedicated PhD student looking at the data and making sense of it in the context of the objects and the history of the objects is really important. And I think it was probably the best use of our lab and my time that I could imagine in the 10 years, because the people that we worked with, Julie Chang is one, Ulrika Korber looked at Luso-Asian lacquer, the first export lacquer into Portugal. That's Ulrika there on the right. Julie Chang looking at carved Chinese lacquer and Coromandel lacquer. And Jonas Wienhoven is looking at what solvents might extract from lacquer in cleaning. And he's at the Ghent University? I think Ghent University, yes. So I think that's kind of a quick overview of what we've done, the things we've accomplished. We've developed the analytical method that is being used throughout the world now in lacquer research projects. We broadened our understanding of the lacquer formulations, what materials are actually in lacquer and how they vary in the layers. We've identified aging markers. I kind of buzzed through a few slides there just to keep to time. But we've identified chemical markers so we can start looking for to target the extent of aging. Radical workshops united conservators and scientists. They enlarged the community of lacquer researchers, and it's really contributed to new projects. The support of PhD research has been very helpful and fun. And we've started our research on cleaning of lacquer. So a number of us think we really are living in the golden age of lacquer research because so many more people are interested in it now. So I want to thank all of the people here who've made my talk possible and my career possible in this field. And I want to thank all of you for your attention. And I think I finished just about on time. So thank you very much.
Yes, and I think I have to thank Michael for starting the golden age of lacquer research because it was really his work that he's just explained that really gave us the idea of what's in there and how it's affecting the behavior of the particular lacquer. So now we're going to go on to our final speaker of this session. Julie Chang is a PhD candidate at the UCL Institute of Archaeology. Her research topic is characterization of East Asian lacquer through investigation of text and materials evidence. She holds a Master of Arts in Principles of Conservation and a Master of Science in Conservation for Archaeology and Museums from the University College London. Julie joined the Getty Conservation Institute from 2012 to 2014 to work in the project Characterization of Asian Lacquer and European lacquers. She participated in numerous technical examinations of lacquer objects and has assisted in recent advances in characterizing Asian lacquer radical workshops. Today she's going to talk to us about Chinese texts on the fabrications of dry lacquer sculpture. So Julie, would you like to join us?
Thank you, Marianne, for your kind introduction, and I will also like to take this opportunity to thank Donna and Blythe for your invitation here. Good morning. My presentation today is on Chinese text on the fabrication of jiazhu lacquer sculpture. This presentation will cover 7 highlights out of 18 historic manuscripts that I'm aware of with information associated with jiazhu. As mentioned in the earlier presentations, lacquer is a sap collected from tapping anacardic trees. It has a long and ongoing tradition in Asia. It can be used as a protective coating, decorative surface, adhesive, painting media, and also as infilling and molding material. The use of lacquer, due to its protected property, is supported by one of the earliest mention of lacquer in Chinese texts, 考工记, the book of diverse craft, believed to be formed around 5th century BCE. According to this text, the lacquer is used to protect bowl from frost and dew. This historic account is being backed up by archaeological evidences. A discovery made at a Neolithic site known as Huahu Qiao has discovered an archery bow coated with lacquer. It is one of the earliest dated lacquer artifacts discovered in China. Archaeology not only supported the text written in 考工记, it also provided us with early evidences for the usage of the term 甲胄. Out of the burial good discovered in the tomb of Wang Yu in Lelang, dated to 1st century CE during the Eastern Han Dynasty period, 4 lacquer tablewares mention the term 甲胄 in their inscriptions. Here is one of the examples. Here is the bottom of one of the lacquer dish, and the term 甲胄 is being pointed at using the yellow arrow. I'm sorry that this is the best image I can find of this object. In fact, this is the only image I can find of this object. It's not very well published. And for those who is less familiar with Chinese characters, I also included the term 甲胄 in yellow, so you can compare it to the original object to see the similarities. This inscription not only tells us the manufacturing technique of this object, it also provided us on details regarding its manufacturing date and location. This particular one is manufactured on the 12 years of Yongping, which is equivalent to 68 CE, at a location known as Shujun in modern Chengdu, around modern Chengdu, Sichuan province. So when did 甲胄 begin to be used on sculptures? We will probably never know the answer. According to the current understanding on the technique 甲胄 in China, it should originated around the Warring States period and was popularized during the Han Dynasty. It entered its maturity during the Wei-Jing Southern and Northern Dynasty period due to the rise and spread of Buddhism. One of the earlier historic mention of 甲胄 sculpture is a text composed by Emperor Jiang Wendi, who lived from 503 to 551. Within this document, he stated his vow to construct a 1.8 zhang gilded 甲胄 Buddha. According to this document, the technique of 甲胄 Tai was already applied to sculpture during the Southern and Northern Dynasty period. Although we do not have any surviving examples of these, by observing the stone statues from the Liang Dynasty, one can imagine what it would be like if any 甲胄 sculpture were produced during this time period. In addition to this document, there are also other mentions of 甲胄 sculpture in nearby time periods. For example, the essay of disputation and correction composed by the Tang Dynasty monk Fa Ling mentioned the 5 Jiazhu Buddha statue created by the hands of Dai'an Dao are unparalleled in their beauties. Dai'an Dao is a famous artist and scholar who lived from 331 to 396 AD. So until this point, we have been using the term jiazhu repeatedly. What does it actually mean? Jiazhu can also be referred to using the term 脱沙, 脱活, or 团换, depending on the time and locations in China. Its early description can be found in the 8th century document, the pronunciation and meaning in the complete Buddhist canon, composed by another Tang Dynasty monk, Huiling. According to this text, jiazhu refer to hollow statue, which is created with lacquered textile. We know from surviving examples that there are mainly 2 types of jiazhu, which are differentiated by the presence or absence of a core, the wood core jiazhu or the hollow core jiazhu. This is supported by the recent study at the Freer and Secular of the 4 Buddha statues in the exhibition. Due to the complexity of terminology and the time limitations, we will not distinguish the 2 in this presentation today. We will use the more general definition of jiazhu, which is a technique that requires the application of multiple layers of textiles and lacquer. In addition to the standard historic documents of jiazhu lacquer, we also found some interesting literary account related to it. For example, there used to be a temple known as Yongming-si, located in the western suburb of the city Luoyang during the Northern Wei dynasty. Here is a map of Luoyang, and the temple is being circled in red. So that is the one we're interested at. Every single mark on the map represents a major Buddhist monastery. According to this 6th century document, Meng Zhonghui had a life-size dry lacquer statue made for this temple, whose marks and signs were so sumptuous as to be a rarity in the contemporary world. In the 2nd year of Yong'an period, 529 CE, every night the image will walk around its base, leaving sunken footprints on the ground. As a result, countless number of visitors want to become Buddha's devoter. In the 3rd year of Yongxi period, this statue suddenly disappears by itself, and nobody ever knows of its whereabouts. So after coming across this account, I think it might be worth checking the security camera at night. We might have some interesting discoveries, we never know. And also, security officers, please make sure the doors are locked on both sides. Anyway, let's go back to being serious. The book of record on Buddha's monastery in Luoyang was written to commemorate the past. The author collected stories and legends regarding the ruined temples in Luoyang, and from those information, a book was composed. Although this book contains valuable information regarding culture, legend, literature, religion, and geographic locations of the time period, it is a literature piece which meant to reflect the author's emotions and sorrow. It is not intended to be a work of truth and facts. Therefore, it does contain many unique stories, like the one we just mentioned. Although the text cannot be taken literally, it still reflects the religious importance and the appreciation towards Jiazhu Buddha statues during this time period. Another unusual mention took place during the Tang Dynasty period. in a famous text, Comprehensive Mirror to Aid in Government, composed by Sima Guang. According to this document, Empress Wu Zetian ordered to construct a large Jiazhu statue. The statue was so large that its little finger can hold 10 people. Tiantang, the heavenly hall, was constructed north of Mingtang, the bright hall, to house this gigantic statue. The hall was then destroyed by a storm when it was first built. It was then rebuilt using 10,000 laborers daily and wood from Jiangling. Within a few years, trillions were spent on the project, which exhausted the government's saving. Some people may argue that this specific document was written during the Northern Song dynasty, which is around 300 years after the supposed construction date of the sculpture. Therefore, the weight of its text should be reevaluated. Interestingly, there's another document known as Chao Ye Qianzai, composed during the 7th to 8th century, the time of the gigantic Buddha, which have a very similar mention about this Lacquer Buddha statue. Inspired by the historic text, in 2010, an action film produced in Hong Kong introduced a gigantic Lacquer Buddha in its imaginary reconstruction of Luoyang. It certainly brought a smile to my face when I first saw it on television. I was like, I know where this idea came from, but I'm pretty sure stylistically it will not look like that. Although one may never be sure was the above documents an exaggeration of the reality or it was purely a folk's tale, there are a few things we can be certain. First, from all the surviving historic records and existing examples, we know that Jiazhu statue was not only created, but also highly prized during the Tang Dynasty. Second, during the Tang Dynasty, it did have the fashion to create large Buddha statues. Surviving examples include the one on the screen, the 35.5 meters high Northern Giant Buddha created during late 7th century, the same time period, from clay stucco with sandstone foundation located in Cave 96, Dunhuang Mogao Grotto. And to give you a better impression about how gigantic this Buddha is, this is an image taken from the ground level. So when you enter the temple and look up, this is what you see, 35.5 meters high. Third, through archaeological excavations, the architectural foundations for both the Bright Hall and the Heavenly Hall were discovered. Both architectures truly exist during the Tang Dynasty. So there may be some truth to the above historic mentions or some base to these mentions. And the Heavenly Hall is being pointed at with using the yellow arrow. And the little building, well, look pretty little on the screen in front of it, is actually the Mingtang, the Bright Hall. And we are actually not certain exactly what those buildings looks like, but here is one of the models created in the Luoyang Museum. After going through many early mention of Jiazhu lacquer and stories associated, some with questionable reliabilities, one may wonder, apart from those early general accounts and the extraordinary stories, is there any surviving information on the fabrication details of Jiazhu? The answer is yes. In the 18th century Qing Dynasty court document, current regulation and presence concerning the Buddha's atelier at the Yuanmingyuan Garden, it records the manufacturing details of Jiazhu sculpture. which according to this text, 12 applications of cloth layer and follows by 12 application of lacquer paste to fill the cloth weave, and then 1 application of foundation layer, 3 applications of intermediate coatings. Afterward, the surface is polished 3 times with water. Then follows 1 application of lacquer paste and 2 applications of red lacquer. Apart from the detailed manufacturing technique, this document also provides us with the material requirements for every 尺 of jiazhu lacquer creations. 1 尺 Chinese food is approximately 32 centimeter. So I will not read through the entire list. It will be a little boring. However, here are a few highlights from the text. Every 尺, 470 grams of raw lacquer is required, together with 4.6 meters approximately of hemp cloth. Apart from the information, the material information, we also know the labor credit requires. So every 尺 requires 2.4 labor credits. And there is also a very interesting note at the very end of the account, which mentioned the artisan, the type of artisan that's required for this work, which is known as 脱砂匠. 脱砂 is another term for jiazhu. So based on this account, we know that jiazhu lacquer requires a specific category of artisan, which is being listed from this 18th century court document. Chinese civilization is extremely fortunate to have a large number and wide range of surviving historical records in existence today. Although very few documentations contains in-depth manufacturing details, after slowly going through and extracting the materials, one can find numerous interesting points and references regarding the past. Some may be more reliable than the others. However, they are all valuable sources of material that allow us to peek through the gap of time and to get a glance of the past. The study of jiazhu lacquer and its challenges is a small window into the larger lacquer study. I would also like to acknowledge everyone who have been extremely helpful within my career and the study of lacquer. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Oh, please.
I am sorry if this was explained. I came a little late for the first talk today. What is the underlying, in the hollow Buddhas, what is the textile original item that is upon which everything is layered? How can it remain stiff in the form? That part I'm still not understanding.
There are mainly 2 types of jiazhu lacquer. One is the hollow core, another is the wood core. The wood core should be more self-explanatory because the wood substrate exists. The hollow core, most people believe it actually uses a clay figurine, and this is supported by a Yuan Dynasty text, which actually mentioned the removal of a clay core from the jiazhu sculpture. Daisy, please.
Thank you, Julie. In your last document, you cite a 18th century imperial court regulations. Basically, there is records of the materials and labor that goes into the. I noticed that the term called 下布.
Yes.
Traditionally, actually, we translate it into rami,
Yes.
not the hemp.
Yes.
So I just want to point out also that with what Donna mentioned as the identification of the fiber, hemp, possibly there is a interesting research in collaboration with people in textile, because the director of the China National Silk Museum, Zhao Feng, he once commented that traditionally in the north, people use hemp a lot, and in the south is rami.
Yes.
苎麻, for
Yes.
example, that traditional Chinese term is 下布. So I
Yes.
think that potentially is some interesting sort of analysis, really looking at the fiber very closely. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Yes, I had trouble picking. I was debating, should I use rami or hemp for that translation over there. Yes, it does brought up some of the challenges regarding translating historic texts into English or foreign language. So with more collaborations between disciplinary and scientific investigation, we should be able to more clearly identify the material mentioned in historic documents in the future. Are we good?
There's one more question there.
Thank you, Julia. I would like to know how can you explain different stage or different body material, different 夹注 technique?
I'm sorry, the bulking material.
Body. I mean, you mean the wooden sculpture and the clay sculpture. They also have 夹注 technique. I mean, how can you explain the difference between wooden material and bamboo or some ceramic or some sculpture technique?
The
夹注 technique.
if I understand your question correctly, you're referring to the different substrates used in lacquer manufacturing. And there's a wide ranges of material that can be used for lacquer manufacturing, including the ones you said, ceramics, wood, basketry. And however, for 夹注 is a specific category that further studies is needed for clarification. But so far, there's mainly two types that we are aware of, wooden substrate and the hollow core substrate. At least according to my current understanding, there are no known ceramics 夹注 present, at least based on my knowledge. Does that answer your question?
We can further discuss later. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a couple more minutes, so maybe if there are any questions for Blythe or Michael, they didn't get to answer any questions. So are there any questions that you have for them?
This question would be for Michael. I'm curious whether in the course of your research it remains possible today to apply the expert system to analyze some of the early work that you did, if you're hoping to revise and update those results, or if there's a point at which the methodology, the GCMS methodology, has changed sufficiently that you can't directly apply the expert system.
Oh, good question, John. Thanks. Our earliest work was done without AMDIS. We used ChemStation, which was the Agilent's software. They're the ones that make the GCMS. And it works well to a point, but we greatly prefer AMDIS because we get the spectral library matching. So we have gone back and we've reevaluated data. The other big difference is in the integrations of the peaks, measuring the area of the peaks or the size of the peaks. ChemStation integrated it differently. Looked at a single ion and was integrated by a single ion. So the peak area ratios for oils are different when their data, the same data is evaluated with ChemStation versus AMDIS. So yes, we have gone back. So we've had more certainty, I think, in some of the peak area identifications, and then some of the peaks just gave us better results. Yeah, good question. Thank you. one thing we did do, Henk van Keulen from the RCE in Amsterdam, he's more of an expert in PyGCMS than I am. He's worked on PyGCMS for his whole life. And he actually developed, or he used a different column than we use. So we started using it after he recommended it so highly. And the big difference, the big improvement that it has is that it allows us to look at smaller samples. So it's a thinner film column, it's shorter, and the peaks come out much sharper and better resolved. So we're using that now. The runs are about twice as fast also, which means we can test more samples each day. More time for coffee then. But that works much better, especially for small samples, and that's really all we're given, especially when we're turning one flake sample into maybe 5 or 10 layer samples.
This is a question for Blythe, Donna, and Denise. You showed us a very striking kind of reconstruction of the original pigmentation on the surface of the Metropolitan dry lacquered Buddha, and particularly I was interested in the color purple. So I wonder whether that color, what is the composition of the pigments there? And also quick comments on the term in Chinese, 紫. In the 16th century treatise of Chinese lacquer, Xiu Shi Lu, 紫 not necessarily can be translated into purple. Today's purple is more like a dark brown based on the correlation comparison between the text and actual objects. So I'm just curious to learn more about the color purple.
Well, it's a good question. That purple was hematite. However, we don't know when that was put on the sculpture because it is the upper layer. So it could have been a later period, unfortunately. So we didn't get all the way down to be able to sample just the first layer, which would have been nice, but that requires a lot of sampling. And this is just not possible on these incredibly rare sculptures.
Well, actually, are there any more questions? I think then we're going to turn it back over to the organizers to tell us about where we go for the Conservation Lab tours. Thanks very much for joining us all this morning for a great session.
Thank you, Marianne. Yes, at let's see, noon, and just about now, you can wander, if you're interested, into the Conservation Lab. There are a number of staff that will be pointing you in the right direction, and there'll also be staff in the individual rooms, so feel free to wander around. Again, at 1:15, there'll be some coffee and sweets in the conference room. Otherwise, use the list of restaurants, your lunch on your own. And as Blythe said earlier, these restaurants can be quite far from this location, inconveniently. But we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
As I was looking at the computer here, I noticed that it doesn't seem like it's plugged in. Right, it's running at 41% battery. Here we go.
Aha, thank you.
There we go.
Brilliant, brilliant.
As long as it doesn't just turn off in the middle of my talk.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Have they loaded your talk?
Yes, my talk is all loaded up.
Great, great. Oh, I'm so glad you saw that.
It's going to be very different than the morning, but...
Well, that's what the afternoon is.
No.
This was the conservation of science.
Yes.
And the afternoon is more art historical and more, yeah, totally different. And it's such a narrow topic that I wanted to bring these two groups of people together.
Well, it's a great opportunity. I don't know if I've never presented a historical conference like this before.
Well, it's, again, a very different conference because we do have scientists and conservators, art historians, anthropologists, but what would you
a religious studies scholar.
Okay, all right.
His intellectual and cultural